Good morning, friends. I am Pastor Michelle at Harmony Creek Church, and today is Sunday, October 26th. It's Reformation Day Sunday. It's a day we remember that Martin Luther posted the 95 Theses on the door at Wittenberg. But today, I also wanted to continue on with my sermon series, and this is me recording my sermon in case you weren't able to make it to church. Or join us on Zoom. And my sermon today is all about Judas Iscariot, because we are continuing to rethink and revisit the so-called villains or bad guys of the Bible. The people in the Bible, the characters in the Bible that have gotten that reputation. And perhaps they weren't 100% deserving of those reputations. And perhaps it's not even a matter of us thinking perhaps they're not villains. It's also a matter of us finding ourselves in these stories. And so let's start with, let us dive right into my sermon. So this morning, we are continuing our sermon series where we explore the so-called bad guys of the Bible. And we're using the book by J.R. Forasteros called Empathy for the Devil. And I've really enjoyed going deeper into some of the more shady characters of the Bible. You know, we've talked about Cain, as in Cain and Abel. And last week we talked about Delilah, the woman who cut off and seduced Samson and cut off all his hair. This week we're talking about another well-known villain, so to speak, of the Bible. One that many of us know, one that we revisit and hear about every year at Easter time. We're talking about the character, the person of Judas Iscariot. And you know, we don't really like to talk about Judas, right? He's the villain of the story. He's the betrayer. He's the one who turned his back on Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. He's the one that set into motion Jesus' ultimate death. Judas is the one that betrayed Jesus with a kiss. It seems like Judas deserves this title, right? Possibly even more so than even Delilah or Cain. But the thing is, what if his story is not that simple? What if Judas's tragedy isn't that he stopped believing, but that he believed, but he just believed the wrong thing about Jesus, about who Jesus was meant to be? Throughout the chapters about Judas, J.R. Forasteros talks about Judas's faith. Because you see, Judas wasn't faithless. He believed in Jesus. He believed in Jesus deeply. He left everything to follow him. Judas saw the miracles, the compassion, and the power. He knew it wasn't just a faith thing. I think Judas knew that Jesus was the Messiah. And the Messiah is defined as the promised deliverer of the Jewish people. That is who Judas believed Jesus was. But the thing is, Judas had an idea, a vision of what the Messiah should be. He wanted the Messiah who would overthrow Rome, who would topple corrupt systems, who would finally put Israel back on top. He wanted a Messiah who would conquer by force. And who could blame him, right? That's what people had always been told to expect, a Messiah of might, a deliverer with a sword, a God who would fix everything once and for all. But the thing is, Jesus wasn't that kind of Messiah, even if his followers wanted him to be. Rarely, if ever, did Jesus live up to the expectations that people had of him. The expectations of what a savior or a Messiah should be like or look like. You know, J.R. Forasteros talks more about Judas's faith and how Judas had faith in Jesus. But for Judas, he thought that Jesus had lost faith in himself. Over and over, Jesus kept doing things that ticked Judas off. Jesus kept failing to meet Judas's messianic expectations. Forasteros talks about the story of Jesus being anointed, and that was one of the pivotal moments in Judas's life, a turning point. That story where Jesus being anointed with expensive oil or nard. And this scene is perhaps, as I said, one of the turning point moments for Judas. And I loved how Forasteros described this scene. Suddenly, the smell of death filled Judas's nostrils. He nearly gagged as the air became thick with nard, which is a really fun word to say. Judas looked back to see a woman he didn't recognize, cradling a jar of nard in her hands and pouring it carefully over Jesus' feet. At first, Judas thought she must be a slave, but she was not dressed as a slave. Judas noted the size and craftsmanship of the jar that must be worth at least a year's wages. Those at the table began to simmer with confusion and disgust. So more than likely, Judas wasn't the only one there that day that was filled with some level of curiosity and some level of disgust, perhaps, at what was happening. The whole area smelled like a funeral procession. Judas felt fury rising in his chest. With tensions as high as they were, her display was in poor taste. End quote. And Judas was the one at the dinner scene that had the courage to stand up to Jesus and to say something. He tells Jesus that this woman is wasting this expensive nard and points out that they could have gotten a lot of money for the nard. And someone else says that they could have fed so many poor people. And that's when Jesus replies that they will always have the poor with them, but they won't always have him. And I'm sure this further upset Judas. And that's a sermon for another day, talking about this text. Then as his story goes, as Judas' story goes, Judas leaves the final supper, the next supper that Jesus was at, not the one where he was getting anointed. But Judas left the final supper with Jesus and his disciples, and he goes to betray Jesus. In this book, J.R. Forasteros recreates in his own words the moment that Judas is standing before the chief high priest. Caiaphas, who was the Jewish high priest, asked Judas why he would want to betray his master. And Judas replies, and this is in the book, "I've seen Jesus do so much good. He gives hope to the poor. He heals the sick. He frees those oppressed by unclean spirits. And he calls us all to love God more. I would not see this end. I love my master with all my heart, and I wish to save him from himself." End quote. I love that last line because I think that's what Judas's point was. Judas was trying to save Jesus from himself. And the thing is, if Judas truly believed that Jesus was God's promised Messiah, and if Judas believed Jesus was in fact losing faith in himself, in his eyes, sorry, my voice, in his eyes, he only had one option. He had to grab the wheel of history for himself. He betrayed Jesus because he might have felt so confident that God would not fail, that at Jesus' arrest, the very skies would open and the armies of heaven would swoop in to destroy the enemies of the Messiah. And the thing is, Judas wasn't the only one back then with Messianic expectations. Back in Jesus' days, Messianic expectations were very diverse, but for the most part, people were looking for a Messiah who would be greater than David. During Jesus' days, Israel was squarely under the boot of Rome. Israel's kings had always been warrior kings, so the Jewish people were constantly on the lookout for a mighty warrior to lead the armies of God against Israel's enemies. The Messiah would take back David's throne with force, more than likely, and rule in peace and justice. So by Jesus' day, it's interesting to point out that plenty of would-be messiahs had raised armies, had opposed Rome, and found themselves hanging on crosses outside the city. But let's remember that Jesus wasn't that kind of Messiah. You see, for Judas, and I think for others, there was no room in a messianic story for suffering. There was only room for triumph. Judas could not conceive of a Messiah who seemingly seemed to lose. His Messiah could only be a victor. His Messiah could only win. His Messiah had to win. In the most recent Superman movie, I am planning on wearing the Superman suit this morning, so I had to mention Superman. And it's the only third time I've mentioned, so I have to say it though, because I felt like it applied today. So in the most recent Superman movie, many people who watched saw the movie were upset because many people said they didn't like this movie, and I don't know why, because I loved it, but everyone's entitled to their own opinions. Wrong they may be. Just kidding. But the reason that, why they said they didn't like this movie? They said Superman in this movie was too weak, too uncertain, too human. They wanted the Superman who could swoop in, flex his super muscles, and fix everything using all his amazing powers. They wanted strength, not struggle. But maybe I think that was the point of the movie. Because maybe the world doesn't need another invincible hero. Maybe the world needs someone who shows us that vulnerability and compassion are strength. That empathy is not a weakness. That gentleness is not weakness. That saving the world isn't about destroying enemies. It's about loving them. My goodness. Even in this movie, Superman tells Lois that the real punk rock is being compassionate and loving. That's the real punk rock. Does that sound familiar? Superman disappointed his fans the same way Jesus disappointed his followers, especially Judas. Because both of these stories, the Jesus story and the Superman story, remind us that true power isn't about domination, something we kind of talked about last week. True power is about love that refuses to give up on humanity. And it's that kind of love, and that kind of love doesn't always look strong. It looks human. And that is the whole point, I believe, and it's what I love most about this new Superman movie. I love that it highlighted the power of Superman's humanity and not necessarily the power of his super strength. Maybe Judas's story and Superman's are both reminders that our own expectations sometimes of power need to be reset. Because maybe we still look for a Messiah who will swoop in and fix everything. Leaders who will fight for us, prove us right, crush the bad guys, and make life easy again. My goodness. I feel like I can relate to that. I don't know about you. It would be much easier if someone else came in and saved the day. Why does it have to be in our hands? Anyone else think about that sometimes? But the thing is, that's not how God works. God doesn't swoop in. God shows up. God doesn't conquer. God connects. God doesn't destroy. God transforms. And God does this through humanity. And perhaps God does that through all of us. That means God does that through all of us. I think that we see this. I think we see that in the person of Jesus. We see the power of humanity. The power of our humanity. Jesus came to show that real salvation happens not when we overpower the world, but when we love it, even when it doesn't love us back. And so I often wonder, if Judas had lived just 3 more days, if Judas had not hung himself, if he had seen the resurrection, would Judas have understood? Would he have seen that Jesus did win? Just not in the way he expected. Because resurrection isn't about conquering death by avoiding it. It's about walking through it and transforming it from the inside. Maybe Judas's story isn't one of betrayal, but it's one of heartbreak. Of a man whose love and hope were too tightly bound to the wrong kind of power. He wanted salvation through might, but Jesus offers salvation through mercy. And here's the beauty. Even in that final moment, Jesus still called Judas friend. And I think that means no one, not even Judas, no one is outside the reach of grace. Not the one who doubted, not the one who misunderstood, not the one who made the wrong choice for what seemed like the reason, and not any of us. And not any of us. What I'm trying to point out in this sermon series is that there is no one out there who's irredeemable. I think it would be amazing if we can be known for the good things we do instead of just the bad. It's like that Ted Lasso quote we've been quoting every week. I want to be remembered for the times I stood back up and I made the right choice. I want to be remembered for the times I took advantage of the second chances I got, and the third chances, and the fourth, and the fifth. And the thing is, I love the fact that Jesus loved Judas, and Jesus loves us even when we get it wrong, even when our faith needs a reset. So as I said, maybe we don't need a stronger Superman or a fiercer Messiah. Maybe we need a more human one. Maybe we need the one that shows up through every single one of us. We need one who shows us that gentleness is strength, compassion is courage, and love is the truest power there is. Love is the real punk rock. Because the real work of saving the world doesn't happen through domination. It happens through love. Always through love. And always through us. People who are brave enough to follow in the way of Jesus, to love in the way of Jesus. It happens through all of us. No matter how imperfect, no matter how much of a mess we are, God is still wanting to work through us to redeem the world around us. May you never forget that you are not only beloved by God, but you are called to be brave and to share that love with the whole world. I think, when I think about the story of the Messiah, my own personal belief is that even reforming our Messianic expectations, I think that Jesus, and I say this and I'm going to say it again because I like saying this quote, that Jesus didn't come to save us, save the whole world. Jesus came to show us how to save ourselves. If only we would listen. If only we would pay attention more, right? My friends, may you never forget that you are God's beloved through and through. And no matter how imperfect you may feel, no matter how many times you may get it wrong, we are still called to rise up every day and do what we can to reform the world around us. God bless you all, my friends, and may you know that you are always loved.